We've all been there. The washing machine is beyond repair. And all you want to know is which new model you should buy. Well, that's where the Which Just Buy This recommendations come in. Hand-picked recommendations that our product testing experts think you should buy. We've got over 50 products with a Just Buy This recommendation, from dishwashers to TVs, cordless vacuums to fitness trackers. And yes, it can be useful to spend time reading our in-depth reviews, but when you need a quick fix, a Just Buy This recommendation can save the day. To find out which products have our new seal of approval, just head to which.co.uk/justbuythis. That's which.co.uk/justbuythis. And get it right with Which.
Funerals are stressful and expensive, even more so perhaps if you don't leave a plan behind. So should you start paying for yours now? Welcome to Which Money. Hello, I'm your host, Lucia Ariano, and with me today I have Holly Lanyon from Which Money. Hello, Holly.
Hi.
And also Simon Cox, the Director of Funeral Solution Expert. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. Shall we start from your recent article, Holly? So you've got an article in the most recent issue of the Which Mag, and it's looking into the cost of funeral planning. What are your key takeaways, the headlines of the article?
Yeah, so like you said, funerals are expensive. Funeral costs are generally on the rise. Sun Life estimated the cost of a simple attended funeral to be over $4,000 in 2024. And for lots of families, if plans haven't been put in place, they can face unexpected costs, and that brings kind of additional stress at what's already a really difficult time. At the same time, in the funeral planning industry, we've seen changes in the last couple of years. So it became regulated in 2022. So we wanted to kind of look at how that's changed the industry for consumers and what the options are if you're looking to buy a funeral plan in advance.
And so you mentioned there that funeral costs are at an all-time high. I mean, what kind of impact is that having on consumers? Are more people than ever struggling to afford it?
Yeah, so in the Sun Life Cost of Dying report, they found that 1 in 5 families had to find, I think, over $2,000 to cover unexpected costs. And yeah, obviously that can be it's a huge lump of money to find if you weren't expecting to pay it, and yeah, can be really stressful. I think maybe Simon can speak to this as well. I think we're seeing kind of changes in the types of funerals that people are choosing to have as well.
Yeah. So people are choosing different types of funeral. Historically, you'd have had a Victoriana funeral, a hearse, limousine, and a normal service. But now, today, you can have a direct cremation, which is an unattended funeral, where the person that's died is collected, they're cremated, and the ashes are returned to the family. Or actually, you can get something in between that now as well. So there are things which are, we call them hybrid, but they're a little like a committal service where just a close family attend for 10, 15 minutes, or something that looks like a traditional funeral but doesn't include funeral cars or the staff that's involved. And actually that can save quite a bit of money.
And so, Simon, some people might have money set aside for their funeral. What's the difference between that and having a funeral plan?
Well, the difference between, say, saving and having a funeral plan is that if you save money, that money is always available. So obviously that's a good thing that if you've saved money, it's always available. But equally, that's a double-edged sword, because if the boiler breaks down or you need to do a big repair to the car, often not, that's the pot of money that you might go towards, and then you'd have nothing set aside. So the difference between that and, say, a funeral plan is the funeral plan meets 3 core needs for someone. It meets the financial needs. So obviously the money set aside for the funeral itself, the emotional needs. So the big problem that people would have if there's nothing set aside is, what did mum or dad want? If you haven't had that conversation, that can actually cause family arguments. So it helps with the emotional side, and then the practical side, because when somebody dies, if you haven't done anything, you then have to go through the planning and the arrangements at a time when your head is basically mush. So you can, with a funeral plan, you just make one call and all of the funeral arrangements will kick into action.
And should we talk a little bit more then about some of the kind of the more practicalities? What about, how does inflation play a part in this? If the cost of the type of funeral you want has gone up, is it affected at all?
So if you buy a funeral planner, essentially what you're doing is you're locking in the price of a funeral in today's price. So if in 20 years, when I first started the cost of dying at Sun Life, the cost of a traditional funeral was £1,900. It's now £4,000. If you'd bought a funeral plan then, actually the risk is passed over to the funeral director. They are promising to deliver those services for what you pay them. Obviously, they will make the money in the interest that they've had from you over that period of time.
And how might you actually pay? Could you pay over a certain period of time? Would you throw caution to say longer payment plans?
Yeah, so you can pay in lump sums, and actually most funeral plans that are bought are paid for in lump sums, but you can spread payments, but beware, because depending on the provider that you go with, you may end up paying as much as £1,000 or £2,000 extra. There are some providers where you pay zero interest. So it's worth asking, if you're ringing around, which obviously you probably should do, is if I spread my payments, how much extra will I pay than I would have paid if I paid you in a lump sum? And for some people that will be, it's nothing extra. And for others it will be, actually it'll be another £1,000-2,000 more.
And this is something that did pop up in the article, isn't it? The different kinds of interest that you might end up paying.
Yeah, so obviously lots of plan providers can offer interest-free payment over 12 months, but I think Simon's found evidence of, instalments paying up to 18% interest, which obviously over a long time will rack up as costing you far, far more for the same plan.
And in terms of any other risks, what about, the idea of, well, is my money safe with this company? What if the company goes bust? How is there any protection there? So the funeral plan industry became regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority in 2022. So that brought in some really important protection for consumers. So as part of that regulation, your funeral plan is protected by the FCS scheme, which means your money's protected and you're guaranteed to get a funeral even if the provider goes bust. I would say make sure, if you're looking to buy a funeral plan, make sure you're choosing a regulated provider. And the FCA have a tool on their website that you can use. So you put in the name of the firm that you're looking at and check that it is regulated. And are there many firms out there that aren't FCA regulated? I mean, is it always a no-no, just kind of don't even consider going with one of those?
I think since regulation, providers that were maybe ne'er-do-wells have gone. So the market is regulated, so it's pretty tight now. So anybody that's selling a funeral plan, yes, it's worth checking, but actually the FCA seem to have driven out the cowboys from the sector, which is a good thing.
And shall we get into some more numbers then? I know we've mentioned a little bit. So you mentioned a few different types of funeral. What kind of figure would you be paying for each of the kind of most standard types?
So a traditional cremation or burial funeral would cost you about $4,100, and that is for a traditional funeral with a hearse plus one limousine. That's the most common traditional funeral. Or if you go to the other end of the extreme, then a direct cremation will cost somewhere between £1,400 and £2,000. An interesting little fact is that a funeral plan from your local independent funeral director is likely to be cheaper than the market leader. So it is worth, even if you have a particular funeral director in mind, is popping in and seeing whether they have a funeral plan that they can offer. So that's £1,400 to £2,000. But then, as I said, there are these two, what we're calling hybrid funeral plans emerging. One, which is this intimate, almost close family only, close family and friends, which typically that'll be about $2,000 to $2,500, or something that looks like a traditional funeral. So anybody attending one of these probably wouldn't notice the difference. The key difference is no funeral cars and obviously the staff that go with it. And that's going to cost between £2,500 and £3,000.
I mean, all these costs, it does seem like a lot. From your experience, are you seeing people, struggling to afford to pay for funerals?
Yeah, I think the funeral poverty has been in evidence for a number of years. I'd say actually the average funeral costs have not been rising so much. The headline figures that we're seeing repeated don't tend to include the cost, say, of a direct cremation in there. And if you were to include a direct cremation in there, you'd actually see the average cost of a funeral has actually plateaued. Right. And that's probably as a result of regulatory interest. So whilst funeral costs had been rising, and that's probably causing more problem, particularly given the cost of living issues that we're all facing. Most recently, we've seen the response from the funeral sector and the funeral plan providers of introducing direct cremations and committals and these other hybrid types of plans. So they're providing, and I think this is what the FCA and the CMA wanted to see, is the providers and offering more competition and offering more different options to suit any kind of budget. So if you think back to maybe 5-6 years ago, when the cost of a traditional funeral was £4,000 and a direct cremation wasn't available, that's made a big difference to a lot of people.
And if you think you might want to get a funeral plan, maybe you don't have the money right now up front, maybe you think actually in 12 months I'm probably not going to have enough to pay it off. Would you recommend putting money aside, or what's your advice for people in that situation?
Put the money aside, because funeral plans, over 50 plans, the issue that you would have if you had an over 50 plan and you started paying and you had to stop, you're going to lose everything. With a funeral plan, the good thing is if you had to stop because of new regulation, the way plans are structured, you actually can get your money back, less a cancellation fee. And I would say, if you're looking at a funeral plan, check the cancellation fee, because with some plan providers, it can be zero, and there are a few providers that offer that. But typically, they're around £250 or £300. But there are one or two also that have really, really harsh cancellation fees. And so like with anything, that if you're going to pay over a period of time, you kind of want to be sure that you're going to be able to continue making those payments. If you're worried about that, then it's probably better to put the money aside until either you've saved enough, or that you can continue to pay, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're charged a cancellation fee, or in buying over 50 you lose everything. And if you're thinking about funeral plans in particular, you're probably better going for a funeral plan than an over 50. There's no contest between the two, I think, now.
And maybe just in a nutshell, while we're on it, how would you describe an over 50s plan?
An over 50s plan is basically life assurance, where as long as you are aged between say 50 and 80, and you can afford to pay a monthly premium, then you can set aside money and you'll be covered for an amount to be paid out. But the big risk with an over 50 plan is that nearly 4 out of 10 people cancel, and those people that cancel, they're going to lose all their money. So you'd be much better off having a funeral plan.
Very good advice there. And I'd like to just dive into a few more of the details, for finding the right price at the right plan for you. So would you recommend, you've talked about, finding out what your local funeral director might charge. Can you do this via a comparison website, or, how do you recommend?
Sadly not. I think it's one of the problems post-regulation, and the FCA would not allow any commission to be paid, and good reasons for that, given its past history in the market. But you can search if you want a funeral plan. If you search funeral plans, you will find obviously the big name providers, whether the co-ops of this world or Pure, who are probably the two largest sellers of funeral plan providers. But it is worth looking around, and if you can find a website that does compare, or at least list out the different companies, that would be helpful. But there are other organisations that you could go to that will help.
Holly, is there anything that you'd add to that, around finding the right place for the right price?
I would just stress, how important it is to kind of first think about what it is that you want. And then when you're looking at different plans, you really do have to comb through the details to make sure that what you want is included. I found, Simon, I don't know if you found this, it's not really a kind of industry standard of this type of plan will definitely include these features. And there are quite a few differences that you need to kind of be aware of. Be really clear about what you want and kind of comb through the T's and C's of your plan to make sure that will be covered.
And I think from a hidden extras, it's one thing I would mention for direct cremation plans. A lot of plans will give you a good price maybe at outset, but there are a number of hidden extras. For example, of collecting the person that's died outside of working hours, collecting the person that's died from their home or a care home might incur an additional cost, or indeed returning the ashes might incur an additional cost. So you're absolutely right, Holly. You need to check the detail.
And you mentioned, hidden extras. Also, just generally kind of extras. What would you expect to be included or pretty much never included? Like flowers, or are there any other things that come to mind?
So yeah, funeral plans won't include anything to do with the wake or flowers. And also, if you have a burial funeral plan, it won't cover the cost of a plot or a headstone. So typically what you're paying for in a traditional funeral plan is the funeral director, the coffin, the hearse, and the limousine, and looking after the person that's died. For a direct cremation, it really is as simple as the person being collected, looked after, cremated, and the ashes being returned. But as I said, sometimes ashes being returned can be an extra cost.
And is there anything else that you would say you should watch out for, when you're combing through the plans or when you're looking at different funeral directors across the board?
With traditional plans, plan providers will often say it's guaranteed, but there are things that are called third-party costs. And in traditional plans, that's paying for the crematorium and the minister or celebrant that leads the service. But there are a number of plans where they'll only give a contribution towards. So it's worth checking whether they're guaranteed or not. But, for example, there are a number of plans where the contribution is only £1,100. And yet there'll be lots of crematoria up and down the country where the charge for a crematory is £1,400 and a typical celebrant will cost about £250. So if you're talking £1,650 versus 11, you're already starting a plan with £550 deficit. I'm surprised the FCA haven't closed that loophole down.
That does seem like a loophole, doesn't it? Because you think that you're covering yourself for that. And is there anything that you would warn us against, anything in addition to this?
I think that point that Simon just made is really important. The whole point of buying a funeral plan is you're making your plans in advance and you're putting something in place to kind of help your family when that moment comes. So, yeah, it's really important to understand, is the full cost of the burial or cremation covered, or actually are my family going to have to find an extra, £500 in today's money, maybe much more when the time comes. So making sure that you are aware of that and have had that conversation if necessary, and have also put some other plans in place, I think is really, really crucial.
I don't know if we've mentioned state help yet, but we have talked about people not being able to afford it. So, is there anything available from the government to help in these situations?
Yeah, the funeral expenses payment in England, Wales, or the funeral support payment in Scotland is there for people who are on benefits that qualify. But that will only pay towards a certain amount. Typically, it will maybe reach about £2,000 without going into the detail of it. So it's never intended to pay for all of the funeral costs. So if people are thinking the government will pay and step in, then that's not the case.
Do you have any advice around having these conversations? Because it's not really something that you want to talk to your parents, your grandparents, friends about. What's your advice here?
It's a really good question. I think the whole point of buying a funeral plan is it's really an act of care for your loved ones. It's about making a really stressful time kind of as easy as possible and removing any doubt about what it is that you would want. So I think framing it in that way could be quite a helpful and kind of gentle way to broach a topic that obviously could be quite tough.
I 100% agree. I think the most important thing is as your question, is to talk about it. We've done research where we can see the biggest number of complaints relates to where a direct cremation plan has been bought and perhaps the person that's bought the funeral plan hasn't talked to the family, and that might have created a conversation within the family of, oh, mum, you don't want to have one of those. Well, we'll want to give you a proper send off. So if you have that conversation, even if you have bought it, at least have the conversation so that, if you bought the plan beforehand, at least you have chance to change your mind, and most plan providers will be happy to make some allowance for that and either move you on to a different plan or what have you.
That's a really good point, actually, because I suppose that probably is quite a common occurrence where someone's bought a plan for themselves and a family member or someone close to them actually says, no, I'd like to offer you more to do it in a different way. Is that something that comes up a lot?
You'd have to ask the funeral plan providers. I think typically because once somebody has made up their mind, it's a big step. To actually face into your own mortality and go, I'm doing it. As you said, it's a decision of care. It's a selfless act to do something like that. But people do that and they probably just don't want to be a burden and they want the peace of mind. So they perhaps put it to one side. But I think, it's if it's following the cultural norm, and our cultural norm has changed from a traditional religious ceremony to more of a celebration of life ceremony, but that's the traditional English funeral today. But by talking to your family or your next of kin or friends about what you wanted, at least it gives you a chance to go, actually, I was thinking about doing this, but now I've talked to them, I've decided on this instead.
Better to have the conversation before you've taken out the plan than after.
Yes.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Obviously, it's a very sensitive topic, but we have covered a lot. Just before we wrap up for today, is there anything that you'd like to reiterate or anything we haven't mentioned that you'd like our listeners to know? Do you want to start us off?
Decide what type of funeral that you want. Ring round or check online for at least 2 or 3 different providers, and then check for possible extras. So that is, if you spread your payments over a longer period of time, you don't want to get caught paying too much extra. Secondly, check there aren't any hidden extras, things like returning of the ashes on a direct cremation plan or collecting the person that's died in their own home. And then finally, check what the cancellation fee is, because if in 3, 4 or 5 years' time, then you don't want to be stung with a nasty charge.
Thanks, Simon. And Holly, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think Simon's summed it up perfectly. Of course, if anyone is looking for more guidance about how to choose a plan, they can head to which.co.uk and see our guide on funeral plans for a bit more information about how to go about making that decision.
And we can actually drop a link to that in the description of today's show. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. It's been a really, really important show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Which, the UK's consumer champion. You can find plenty more advice about what we discussed today in the show notes. There you'll also find a link to become a Which member for 50% off the usual price, an offer exclusively available to you, our podcast listeners. Joining Which will not only give you access to our product reviews, our app, one-to-one personalised buying advice, and every issue of Which magazine across the year, but you'll also be helping us to make life simpler, fairer and safer for everyone. Don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. That way you'll be notified whenever we release a new episode of Which Money, Which Shorts, or any other podcast that we make for you. And if you want to get in touch with us, then follow us on social media at Which UK or drop us an email to podcast@which.co.uk. See you next time.
If you're enjoying this podcast from us here at Which, then why not become a Which member? Right now, we've got a special offer, especially for podcast listeners, meaning you can choose any of our 3 membership tiers for 50% off the usual price. Starting at just £39.50 for a full year, you can get Which magazine delivered direct to your door. For the same price, you could also choose a digital Which subscription, giving you access to all of our product reviews, the Which app, and the digital edition of Which magazine. What's more, you'll also be able to use the Ask Which service for personalised one-to-one buying advice. Or why not get a full access Which subscription for just £49.50 for a full year? Don't forget, that's 50% off the usual price. To join Which or to find out more, just head to which.co.uk/podcast offer. That's which.co.uk/podcast offer. Or click the link in the description for today's podcast for 50% off a Which annual subscription.